Good afternoon, everyone, or almost afternoon, and welcome. We are so glad that you've joined us today for what we know will be an inspirational conversation. I'm Abby Palco, Director of the Maxine Platzerlin Women's Center. I'm speaking to you here from the Women's Center on grounds. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are on today, the Monacan Nation, and pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. For opening logistics, this is a regular Zoom call, so I recommend putting your screen on speaker view today. Since I miss reminding people in person to silence their cell phones, mostly I miss being in person, I will ask you to confirm that you are muted at this point. And I want to let you know that we are recording today's talk. The Women's Center is honored to host the Beverly Cobble Rodriguez Lectureship, supporting women's education and global leadership. In 2014, Beverly Cobble Rodriguez and Joe V. Rodriguez Jr. generously established an endowment that allows us to host an annual lecture on women's education and global leadership, with a special emphasis on healthcare, multinational business, and the liberal arts. This event is specifically intended for undergraduates to give students the opportunity to learn from an inspiring woman who's achieved a high level of success as a prominent leader in her chosen field, to encourage today's students to aspire to be tomorrow's leaders. It is an honor to include this annual lecture among the offerings that we have for student engagement here at the Women's Center. Several partners across grounds have joined with us in co-sponsoring today's Rodriguez Distinguished Lecture. So I would like to thank the Darden School of Business, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the McIntire School of Commerce, and the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for including this event on the Community MLK celebration calendar. We appreciate this collaboration and support. I also want to thank the members of the Women's Center staff who assisted in planning Melissa's visit today, especially my interns, Guadalupe Pinto and Emma Abraham, who developed the questions for today's conversation. As well as I'd like to thank the selection committee who helped confirm our choice. Hosting the Rodriguez Lectureship is a team endeavor, and I appreciate everyone's contributions to the event's success. Today's co-hosts are Karishma Srikantha and Emma Abraham. Karishma, a Master of Public Policy student at the Batten School, earned her bachelor's in Global Public Health and a minor in Global Culture and Commerce from UVA in May 2020. She is the 2020-2021 Cassell's Fellow at the Women's Center, working with the Engaged Scholarship team, where she draws on her passion for mentorship and her interest in global connectivity. Emma Abraham, one of my director's interns, is a second-year double major in computer science and cognitive science with an intended English minor. She brings her interest in the struggles to define modern womanhood to her internship. In addition to interning at the Women's Center, Emma is an RA in Woody Coffin. We are thrilled to have you both representing the Women's Center today, and I will turn it over to Emma, who will introduce today's guest lecturer. Emma.
Thank you, Abby. Today I have the honor of introducing Melissa Thomas Hunt. Melissa Thomas Hunt is a strong role model for women aspiring to leadership. In her current role, she brings her expertise in building inclusive global teams to Airbnb, where she is the head of global diversity and belonging. She was recently named Senior Global Fellow of the Lauder Institute at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to joining Airbnb, she served as Vanderbilt University's Vice Provost for Inclusive Excellence and as the Global Chief Diversity Officer at UVA's Darden School of Business. Melissa earned her BS in Chemical Engineering from Princeton University and her PhD in Organizational Behavior from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Throughout her career, she has taught executives and MBAs leadership, team dynamics, and negotiations. Her research focuses on the factors that unleash, leverage, and amplify the contributions made by individuals, particularly women, underrepresented individuals, and numerical minorities. Please join us in welcoming Melissa back to grounds.
Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you again, Melissa, for taking time to chat with us today. I'd love to get started by talking a little bit about the work that you've done throughout your current role at Airbnb and throughout your career at large, and specifically about how you work to encourage others to embrace new and uncomfortable ideas throughout your work.
This is like the magic question, right? If we had the silver bullet for it. You know, the notion of uncomfortable ideas or new ideas is something that's integral to the work that I have done advancing diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging. And at the core, we have to recognize that we often invite people into conversations and spaces and ask them to contribute something that's novel, to engage on a topic with which they're not familiar. And yet we actually don't create the space for them to make mistakes. And so part of the challenge is that people are fearful, that we say we want innovation, that we want new and interesting ideas, and for us all to wrestle with it, but we don't create that context. Researchers have talked about the concept of psychological safety, which is the notion that an individual feels that when he, she, they contribute ideas, that they are going to be valued, and that certainly they're not going to be punished for it. And so we need to think about, how do we create environments where people actually feel comfortable engaging, either sharing a different or difficult perspective that may push others to their growth edges, whether it means that we have to invite that. And oftentimes, particularly in a hierarchy where there's a manager or a leader, a faculty member, administrator, and a student, and we say, you know, we really want to hear what's on your minds. We have to model the behavior that when individuals tell us things that are uncomfortable for us, that we continue to invite that conversation, that we don't get into a defensive posture. This is really a muscle that we have to build community-wide, where there's an invitation put forth to individuals who might not otherwise contribute. And then there's a receptivity and a wonderful leveraging and appreciation that's demonstrated for it. But we have to realize that people are going to make mistakes, and that's part of the process. And if we create an environment where making mistakes is part of the learning journey, then we're going to see a lot more individuals being willing to engage with new and uncomfortable ideas.
So our next question is, how do you make the people you work with feel valued and supported?
So the first thing is, you have to understand who they are, about what do they care, who are their people. Questions like asking them, oh, you know, what are you most proud of? If you look back on your family's history and their struggles or journey, as a family collectively, what are you proud of? What have you overcome? You have to ask individuals what keeps them up at night. You know, what are the things that are on their mind? So often we, particularly in the context of work or even in academia with school, we think about like the tasks at hand, right? The learning at hand, or the job that needs to get done. And there's an expectation that individuals are going to be solely focused on that particular context. And our human nature doesn't allow us to really operate like that. We can pretend, but we always have in our backdrop the larger constellation of events in our life, of the people we care about, the things we're worried about. And we can talk more about in this particular moment, but even just generally speaking, when we ask people to leave a part of themselves at home, given the amount of time we spend at work and at home, that becomes incredibly stressful. And people have to actively manage what parts of their other life are they allowing into their work or their school context. And so part of demonstrating that an individual is valued to us, is supported, is really being curious about who they are, inviting their opinions, and recognizing that they're a holistic individual, and there are parts of that that are going to need to show up in the primary context.
Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting you've mentioned now the culture of curiosity and how to create this sort of supportive environment. And I was wondering how does this intersect with important issues like equity and inclusion in the workplace, creating a culture of curiosity, that is.
Yeah, so when we fail to sort of step outside ourselves or what we know, it doesn't lend us to appreciating and valuing others. When we're curious, when we want to learn more, when we recognize that our own experience isn't the only experience, then it allows us to truly, from a place of positivity, to engage others, to ask questions, to learn. When we do that, it allows us to see individuals in the humanity that spans across all of us, regardless of where we fall socioeconomically, religion, our gender identity, our sexual orientation, where we locate globally in the world. And when we see that humanity and we're interested in learning more, when we're curious, then it also allows us to stand up for people and for other groups. It allows us to advocate and lend our voices. And so curiosity is absolutely at the essence of advancing diversity and equity and inclusion. It also allows us to examine our own experiences and understanding the places where we have experienced privilege and where others have not. And it allows us to value the achievements of individuals and groups of individuals who've had lots of obstacles put in their way. And it also allows us to reflect upon our own obstacles and extrapolate to the experiences that others may have. So it's absolutely fundamental. I mean, I consider myself to be a lifetime learner. Part of why I made the very unexpected jump from academia to the tech industry. My kids laugh when they finally realized that I was moving to Airbnb, and they said, "Mom's going to be a tech executive," and they howled. And so, but it was the curiosity that drove me to really understand, was there more for me to give, and would I benefit from now really going to the applied from having been largely in a theoretical world? And so curiosity is something I hold dear.
Do you think you could elaborate how your identity and experiences as a woman of color has molded your research endeavors and how you show up in the workforce, especially with this transition from academia to tech?
Yeah. So this is a really hard one, particularly in this moment and in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, which just really put a fine point on the way in which Black and Brown and other bodies have been treated, particularly in this country, but actually around the world. And the reason I frame it that way is my identity as a woman of color, as a Black woman, is inextricably linked to my 53 years on this planet. So it is almost it's the air that I breathe, and when I think about how do I pull it apart, I think about the fact that I am the child of an individual who was part of the Great Migration. My father was born in Quitman, Georgia, and in the early 40s, his family left. I had not understood until very recently. It's because they feared for their safety as Black individuals at that time, and they moved to Detroit. That lens helps me in understanding almost all of the advice that he has given me, that it is through that lens of safety and security and wanting to be able to protect me and my brother. My mother's family hails from St. Croix, immigrants, and the experience that they had. My mother was raised as Catholic. I was raised as a Catholic. My father is a Southern Baptist. All of those things interacting with the fact that in my early years of elementary school and middle school, I went to a private school in New York City, and I realize now, I didn't understand it in this way, that I was a triple minority. I was Black in a almost exclusively white school. I was middle class or upper middle class in a school of the very wealthy. And I was Catholic in a school that was probably 95% Jewish. And so when your identities in some ways put you in a more marginalized, certainly unique position, it just becomes the way you see the world. I will add, though, that in that particular context, I was a very strong student, and that had a lot of currency. And so at a very early age, I began to understand the intersection of achievement with possession of characteristics that might otherwise have been categorized as being lower status, and the entree that allows me. Now, that's not always the case. That's not always sufficient, but it framed why education was so important. It also always allowed me to take the perspective of the outsider and to look for ways to bring others into the conversation who might not have had access. And so so I was always aware of being a Black woman. When I went to college, I actually became more aware of being a woman. I was a chemical engineering major. I was in STEM before we referred to it as STEM. There were very few women in engineering, but particularly in chemical engineering. I was aware of how my voice wasn't always valued. I was aware of the diminished confidence that they experienced during that time. And those experiences, while largely positive, did frame the questions that I ask in my research. I became really interested in contributions of knowledge, whose voices get heard, who's seen as expert, who is not. How do you code someone's competence? A whole host of issues in that particular arena. What assumptions do people make about others when you see the intersection of an elite institution, but characteristics that otherwise would suggest that maybe they shouldn't be there? And so everything about who I am has informed the way I think about research, the type of questions, and ultimately what I'm hoping to do with the questions and with the data and with the analyses, in giving more access, in helping institutions, be it academic institutions or corporations or the tech industry, to really understand the talent that they have at their disposal, and how they can unleash that potential, and what are some of the factors that get in the way, and how we can actually mitigate it. The other thing that was really influential and has informed the way I think about the world on a really positive side. So I left the private school that I attended after 8th grade, and I went to Bronx High School of Science. And it wasn't until my 20th reunion, when I looked at the constellation of individuals who had been there, that I realized that so much of my curiosity, so much of my interest in other people's experiences and the desire to have people come together across difference was really formed there. And I can think of our courtyard, where during a free period, you would see individual groups of students from different racial and ethnic, identities who were gathered together. But then you would see like one person leave their group and go across to talk to their friend who is in another group about, honors math homework, or they gathered because they were in activity together, or they were in classes together. And when I think back upon that time, it was foundational because it said that people can, it's a both and. People can have strong identities, they can support the individuals, they can celebrate the cultural heritage that they share, and they can also stretch, and they can engage individuals who are interesting to them and who are kind to them. And there doesn't have to be hostility and animosity or judgment associated with that. And so I didn't know it at the time, but that reflection has really fueled sort of what I hold as the North Star for the way that I hope people are able to engage with one another, particularly in academic contexts.
Thank you so much. That was really inspiring to me, and I really appreciated hearing you talk about that. And in particular, thinking about how to intersect empathy in our efforts to promote equity and inclusion in all the work that we do. I was wondering if you had any advice that you would give to members of marginalized groups about ways to successfully navigate these spaces and to implement these sort of practices into their workplace. And then going off of what you just mentioned about, those intersections of academic achievement with all of these other identities, what are those common threads that people can really take and sit with in this work?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that for as long as I've been a business school professor, and it's still my dominant identity, despite the fact that I'm not doing that now, there have always been two things that I've been trying to achieve. And one is helping individuals to acquire the tools to navigate the environments in which they find themselves, and to recognize the reality of that landscape, and to recognize when they may need to modulate their behavior, when they need to share more of themselves, but how to understand the sort of political landscape. The other side of that has been focus on organizations and how do they need to evolve so that they can see leaders in different packages, so that they can create context and cultures and norms that are inviting of a broad array of individuals. And I say that because it's both, right? So the question you ask is largely geared towards the minority population. And I just want to acknowledge that organizations have a lot of room for growth as well. But while they're growing, here are the things that I think one should think about. So it's about navigating, and it's about making choices. And so I often, in conversation about a particular challenging situation, and I'll say to the individual, it's your choice how you engage, but here are the potential outcomes, right? So that can mean in a particular situation, someone has, there's been an affront, it could be outright discrimination, and they want to directly confront the individual. Absolutely their choice. May not be the route to achieving ultimately what they want. And so it's, what are you trying to achieve? What do I need to do in the moment? What's consistent with my values? So there are times where there is a difficult situation, and I know that given the larger mission that I have of bringing people in, that reacting out of anger is probably not going to advance me on that path. But in the moment, I may feel that it might be the anger that needs to get expressed, right? And so what I like to do is to help people be really deliberate about what they value, what they're trying to achieve, and therefore in a given moment, how they may react in a situation. So much of what we do is about power, it's about access. We also have to think about, what does it mean to be successful, right? So there's success in our profession, and that can be absolutely wonderful. But I think we can all think of examples of people who have success in their professions, like they're at the highest level, or they earn, or they have accumulated lots of wealth. And there are other aspects of their life where probably they would say they were not successful. Their family life, their own personal reflection and sense of fulfillment, their sense of contribution to something larger than themselves. And so the first thing that one needs to do, and I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 months thinking about this for myself, thinking about who do I want to be? What do I care about? And when I look back, what do I want to be remembered for? And letting that inform how you engage. What that means is that you have to look to people to also be allies, to be advocates, to be sponsors. And who are those people? They're often unlikely suspects. So I think all too often, as we are marching forward in our careers, we're looking up, right? And we're looking, who is that person ahead of us that's going to sponsor us? And what I would say is that we actually have to spend more time nurturing the people behind us, bringing them along, sharing our lessons with them, because advancement is not a linear process. And often the people who are behind you end up ahead of you. And there is no one more grateful than someone you helped that you didn't have to help. People remember that. Also thinking about our peers. When we think about, there's something called optimal distinctiveness from Marilyn Brewer in social psychology, where individuals who find themselves in sort of rarefied positions often sort of cherish the fact that they're the only one. And what that means is when we think that there are others like us who are coming in, we might experience threat. And so rather than engaging our peers, similar others, in a collaborative or a co-conspiratorial endeavor where we're all gathering information and we're sharing that information and we're acknowledging others' accolades and promoting them, we often end up in a really competitive stance. And it's really not, the competition is not the way to advance. It's through the locking arms, even when it's not a public locking arms. So often the people that I'm closest to in an organization, very few people know who those people are, right? But we support and advance one another. And so what I would say is look behind you, look to the sides, of course, look to those individuals who signal that they're willing to invest in you. That's absolutely critical. But there are other people who can help in the constellation. And then ultimately you have to trust yourself.
Thank you for that insight, Melissa. Taking stock of the situation at the moment, I think we'd be remiss not to mention how the pandemic has affected this all and the current workings of the world. And we'd like to ask, how has the pandemic and the interlocking crises we faced in 2020 shifted your leadership style and FL? And do you think you'll be doing anything for the future?
So it has shifted my leadership style. I would hope that if you were to ask my team, that they would say that they've seen more grace from me, that I have been more supportive, that I've assumed more positive intent. When you're on Zoom calls, it's really hard to know, exactly what are people doing, or what did they mean by something, or what did that look, or if they look distracted, is it because a child came in from the back, or there's an elder person that they have to attend to? So assuming positive intent is really important. It's also absolutely critical, and I've really worked to refine this, particularly in this moment, of providing immediate and direct feedback. This is an environment where there's so much ambiguity that we have to be really clear about our expectations and about what went well and what didn't go well, and to actively develop others. We have to demonstrate that care. We talked earlier about support. It's really important to build space in any meeting for time catching up with individuals. We would normally have that sort of standing outside as we were waiting to go into a meeting or a class and casual conversation, and we would be able to check in. But now we actually have to build that in. We have to ask how people are. And I would say, one of the things that I have been working on and trying to build with my team is agility. So in March, I was in San Francisco, sheltering in place, and San Francisco Mayor London Breed put us in sheltering in place. I hadn't even heard of the term sheltering in place at that time, and we needed to and the rhetoric was 2 weeks to flatten the curve, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? And what time has told us is that there's so many unknowns, and so being agile and being open to the possibility that the plan is going to have to shift, that there are going to be adjustments, that individuals may get sick, or that their care providers get sick, and so therefore they're caring for their children, or that there are challenges that are posed to our older population that are affecting students, but also our employees, and the pivots that need to move forward. The other thing that I've learned, and this is a journey for me, is that I can't care for my team if I don't care for myself. And so the irony is that in a pandemic, I have probably been better at a regular habit or routine of self-care than I have in many, many years. And it was out of necessity, because I needed a place to decompress, a place to put my stress. And so I created a regular water jogging routine and a one-on-one Pilates routine. Really one for the cadence of it, right? So that I knew that there was something predictable in my weeks, but to center myself so that I would be better prepared to center others. And just, the recognition, it puts a fine point on, there really is no distinction between work and non-work. That's become clear now. It's always been the case, but now we can't ignore that. And also to just think about health and mental health challenges that we don't know how they manifest. And just because it's not a manifestation in our own lives, we can't presume that someone else isn't faced with that. And so we really have to open the aperture to understand there are an array of things that may be affecting our teammates that we just have no idea. And so asking and observing and taking the time are really key things. So, we have Slack and text and email and Zoom. The multimodal way of checking on people becomes really important. And I don't typically like to multitask across all those platforms, but I found that I have to meet people where they are if I really want to demonstrate care for them. The other thing I'll say is this environment has made many workplaces chaotic. And I view my job as providing the umbrella of trying to protect my team from the chaos that they don't need, but still allowing and filtering the information that they do need to do their jobs.
Thank you so much. I think we can all, every single one of us on this call can relate to the trials and tribulations of Zoom. I think, this is our last question, but as a student, I'm really curious to hear your answer to this, because navigating the classroom in an online world is one thing, but navigating, the professional world is a whole other ballgame. So I was wondering if, in a pandemic for students and professionals alike, there may seem like there are little to no opportunities for growth and development. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions for students who are looking to get into the workforce, or just people in general, about how to gain experience right now and how to grow in this world.
Yeah. So, while not obvious, because I think it's all taken us some time to adjust to, the way life was, this is actually an opportune time to learn and develop and be curious. And it's also a great opportunity to stretch and do things that we think we're not particularly competent at, because there's really no one looking or judging us. So, there have been, I think, record numbers of people who are, trying to take on a new language. And that's evidenced by like all the language apps that are seeing increased usage. I think time for a hobby and painting and those types of things, the things that give us joy, but also stretch us in ways that we may not have been stretched. Music and music producing or dancing or so many things. And I know TikTok has brought that live to many of us. But I would also think about it, from a more career standpoint of, this is the time to learn as much as you can about what people do. Individuals would be surprised how receptive people on LinkedIn can be. And there's research by that suggesting that depending upon who the individual inquiring is perceived to be, that there may be a differential response. And that's absolutely true. But nevertheless, people will respond. And what I will say is that if you reach out to people with a personal note that shows that you have done a little bit of extra research and that there's a specific question that you have in mind, something that you want to bounce off of them, and you ask for a really finite amount of time, many people will be quite receptive to that, because keep in mind that many people are also not commuting, that they are going from one Zoom meeting to another, and having the opportunity to speak to a bright, engaging student is something that would be welcome to many of them. And so I would say this is an opportunity to look at profiles, think about dream jobs, ask people if they have 15 minutes to talk about their career trajectory. I think it's also a wonderful time to think about the possibility of internships in places where you might not otherwise have thought to apply because of the geographic location, which is now rendered sort of not pertinent, because we're all, whether it's Zoom or WebEx or whatever platform we're on, we're remote and we can travel around the globe. And that becomes fascinating. And I know while our cultural investigations are so much richer when we're there in person, there are opportunities that exist that we couldn't have reached out to easily that now we can. And so I would say to think really big, to dream about what it is that you want to do, what it is that you want to learn, and look for the people who are doing that and reach out to them and offer your services. Is there research that they need done? Is there a student perspective that they need? And see what comes of that.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I might send you a request on LinkedIn now.
Totally fair. I look forward to it.
So that was our last question that was pre-prepared. So now we'd like to open the floor for any of the participants. Either you can send them in the chat and Karishma and I will alternate reading them out loud, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly.
Yes, hi. Can everyone hear me okay? Oh, hi, I'm Richard Stallings, and I just recently started in my new role as diversity and inclusion manager with the company I've been with for 23 and a half years. It is something that is completely different from what I used to do in the past. However, it's something that I'm very passionate about. I'm an extreme extrovert. I love being around people. So this is sort of kind of right up my alley. And if I can help someone along this journey, and this diversity and inclusion is a journey. It is something that the present situation that we're going through today did not happen overnight, nor will it be fixed overnight. However, my goal is to have my fellow colleagues to join me on this journey. And the goal is for everyone to feel like I feel, meaning that I can come to work or go out in the world and be richer and be my authentic self, right? So my question to Margaret is, you've covered a lot of things and it's been very inspiring to me, as I stated in the chat. But the one question that I have for you is, what has been the most challenging thing for you in respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how did you handle that?
Thank you, Richard. So there have been many challenging things that I think you and many others will have experienced. I think the things that are most difficult for me usually don't have to do with me specifically, but they have to do with my inability to have an individual who is talented and bright and motivated, not seen, not recognized, not promoted. And that is very hard. And whether it's in an academic environment with faculty, or whether it's in a company with employees, as much as we can drill down on best practices and having clear criteria for evaluating people, either as they come into the company or while they're there, there are pockets. There are ways in which our rubric can fail us, and it becomes really challenging to articulate the ways in which bias may be creeping in, or the ways in which someone is not being seen, or the way the evaluator's own experiences and what they value and their own comfort level is obscuring the talent of someone else. And so I continue to work every day to mitigate where that happens, and to advocate and to lend my brand where I can. But I'll be honest, it's quite imperfect, and that is what's really hard for me.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat from Rhonda Henderson. She says, Dr. Thomas Hunt. I'm a Darden graduate. How did you navigate from academia to the tech sector? Did they approach you? Did you seek them out?
Yeah. So I left Darden and went to Vanderbilt, and I was in the Provost office, advancing inclusive excellence. And on LinkedIn, I got a message. This is sort of like one of these classic cases. I got a message from someone who had been part of an interrupting bias scholar practitioner multi-round consortium. One round of which I had hosted at UVA at Darden. And at that time, she had been at another company. She reached out and she said that she was at Airbnb, that they were looking for a head of global diversity and belonging, and would I consider talking to them? And much respect for her. I had been a guest on Airbnb for 5 or 6 years then, but other than my own experiences with my family, which had been wonderful, I really knew nothing about the company. In particular, I didn't know that it was a company that had as its mission that anyone can belong anywhere. Much of the work that I had been doing at UVA and at Darden was around sense of belonging, and certainly at Vanderbilt it was. And to find a company that had as its core creating belonging was quite compelling. Academic institutions writ large can often move a little bit slower in lots of realms, but particularly in the advancing diversity and inclusion and equity realm. And I thought that this offered the opportunity to maybe move a little bit faster and take my hypotheses about my philosophy and approach to doing this work on the ground, and see if I could test them out a little bit faster, and that I could continue my curiosity journey and learning. And so after many conversations and some quite intensive interviews with our CEO, I made the very difficult decision that I was going to join Airbnb, and it's been quite the whirlwind.
So we have a question from Marla asking, how would you suggest engaging colleagues and who are resistant or antagonistic towards DEI trainings and other reform efforts?
Oh, that's the $1,000,000 question. It depends where they sit in the organization. So it depends on your proximity to them. Is this someone who sits on your team, who's a peer? Is this your manager? Is this the CEO of a company or the leader of a business? So all of those would inform the approach that I would recommend. So let's just take it someone on your team and they are relatively a peer. What we know is that narrative and storytelling tends to be really impactful. And so the potential of sharing one's own experiences or experiences of others in short bite-sized snippets often can be quite compelling. It can help people, it can open them to considering that their own experience is not the only experience. And that becomes the starting point. There has to be a recognition that there actually is a challenge or a problem. The next phase is to help people understand the ways in which they contribute to that. We all contribute to it, but the way they specifically contribute to it. And to also, to the extent possible that they don't feel judged, that it's a conversation that's helpful. Now we have to be really careful because it is not the job of marginalized individuals with marginalized identities to make other people feel comfortable. That is not their job. And to the extent that they are willing to engage in a way that is less likely to put people in a defensive posture, it is easier to move people up a learning curve.
All right.
Thank you. This is Marla. I appreciate the answer. Could you talk a little bit about if it's not somebody who's a peer, if it's somebody who works at a higher level in the organization? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you might imagine, since I sit, as an executive member at Airbnb, I get to engage with individuals that are at higher levels in the organization. I will offer that for me, the strategy is much the same. It's a lot of narrative, it's a lot of storytelling, It's a lot of sharing my own mistakes that I've made along the way and the things that I am most fearful of, because I often find that people are fearful of what's going to happen when I get in the room of training. Like, what are they going to say to me and how are they going to make me feel? Right. So deconstructing that a little bit can helpful. If it is actually a individual who is in a superior position, it depends on the nature of the relationship more broadly. If it's a positive relationship, if they have demonstrated care and value, then sharing about your own experiences can be really helpful. If it's someone with whom you're in an antagonistic relationship, then it's probably best to enlist the support of others in the organization who are in a more formal capacity. So I spend a lot of time in conversation with individuals who may not feel comfortable sharing directly with particular parties, be they peers or others. And I either brainstorm ways that they can do that, or I provide feedback without attribution, or depending on the situation, if it's egregious, we all have reporting responsibilities. And sometimes we do have to take to formal channels. It's what we are supposed to do. So multiple strategies.
Thank you.
All right, so we have a couple questions in the chat about political segmentation and how to sort of address that in the moment. Sorry, I'm trying to find the question in the chat. There we go. Okay, so from Bob Barnett, Bob asks, what are your thoughts on how to incorporate our current political divide into diversity and inclusion efforts, both given political segmentation on the right and the left? And similar to that, we have a question here from Allison Linney, who asks, I'd appreciate hearing what you think about the term white supremacy. I'm glad that we're talking about the phrase and would like to know what it means and how to overcome it, and listening with empathy to clients and friends who are struggling with its use.
Thank you. Was it Bob who put in the first question, did you say? So thank you to Bob, and I would expect no less from Alice, my friend Allison, in asking me the super hard question. So I'll take them because I think the two are related. And you know, mine may not be a popular view at the standpoint, and I'll talk from this standpoint. If we go back in time to the weekend post-election, when the election was finally declared, with the Biden-Harris ticket as being winners, and there was an outpouring in the streets of celebration of people who felt vulnerable, who were scared for their families under the last administration, who were looking to the future as a renewed sense of opportunity, and were joyous. That whole weekend, I felt fairly empty and sad. And that's not because I wasn't pleased with the outcome, but what it said to me was that, you know, there were 70 million people who had made a different decision, and this was throwing salt in the wound. And that I think we fundamentally don't have an understanding of the factors and the experiences that have caused the rifts that exist along political lines. I really don't think it's the rifts along political lines. I think it's rifts in humanity. Some of those rifts are fundamental to the founding of this country, right? There is a subordinated hierarchy in which Black and brown people, Black people, Native Americans were intentionally put at the bottom of the hierarchy for economic reasons, to allow whites to engage, working whites to feel good about their circumstances, even though they were not being treated well by elites in this country. And so we have to recognize that this is part of our founding, that in our better moments, we have moved away from it, but that we have to understand that you don't get those numbers just because of political ideology. It's because of the lived experiences of people, the lack of education that we've provided about the source of those experiences. And we've got to do something pretty radical and transformational to help people before we can move forward for all, and before more marginalized communities can get the benefits that they are deserving of, that are true to who we say we are, but that we have to recognize that it's a much more fundamental schism that we have to address.
Thank you. We have a question now from Cindy asking what has surprised or challenged you about the culture of your current organization compared to academia?
Oh, what has surprised me? So when I first landed, when I was interviewing and I went to Airbnb and headquarters, which is at 888 Brandon, although really very few people are there now, I was just astonished. So for many of you, you may have experienced being in sort of tech cultures, but there were growing walls of grass, and there was kombucha and on tap, and cafes and bright colors, and so think of whatever the coffee shop or tea shop or place you like to go that gives you energy, that it was there on steroids. And so just sort of visually taking it in and trying to understand what this place was and how people work. There aren't offices, and so so that vibrance of culture and sort of modernism and access to the CEO, so people will email him and share what's on their mind. So those are all things I was taking in. When I joined the company, I realized it's a company that likes to gather. I had promised both my boss, who's the head of employee experience, which is HR, and the CEO, that I would engage broadly around the globe. And so I did. I set off to go to as many of our offices as I possibly could. And the thing that was common, one was that vibrancy, right, the visual effects, but also there was a hum, there was an energy, and you could see people gathering. And so certainly they were there to do their work, but they were actually there because some of their best friends were at work and they loved coming in. And so when I think of Airbnb, I think of a place that really colleagues really adore being with one another, and they love the informality, they love to gather, and there were big celebrations and little celebrations and lots of work that was done, but it was a gathering culture. It was a culture that was designed to foster belonging, and doing that to the fullest is why I got hired. But in the essence, it was a culture of belonging, which is why it's been particularly challenging being virtual, because we've had to find other ways to support and gather and connect with the people the colleagues that we care deeply about.
Thank you so much. I think we have one final question to wrap up today's event. So Alan Townsend asks, hi, Dr. Thomas Hunt. Could you offer recommendations for facilitating collaboration in diverse teams and organizations? We know that diversity of perspectives can contribute to more creative ideas, and I wonder what advice you have for overcoming efficiencies to collaboration that we might have for a more homogenous team, or maybe that's a false premise.
Did you put in the false premise, or is that in the question?
That's in the question.
So it's a little bit of a false premise. So we do know that knowledge-based, experience-based, informational diversity does positively affect performance. The performance boost from dimensions of diversity derived from societally imbued characteristics is a lot more murky. And we as researchers have not done a sufficient job of pulling those apart. That often it is really, really hard to pull a demographically diverse group of individuals together and get them to work efficiently, particularly because those differences are imbued with status and because we're human beings and we show up with our preconceived notions of who's expert and who's not an expert, and we code that pretty quickly. And so, you know, what I have found is that if we train managers how to do this, how to articulate the value of any given member, regardless of the package that they come in, and the manager has the responsibility for curating, for validating, for helping the team to cohere, that is a huge unlock so that you can actually get to the divergent perspectives, experiences, knowledge base, expertise that the team absolutely needs to leverage. But we often get lost in the diversity helps performance, and there are a lot of friction points that we really need to overcome. Yes, it does, but it often gets masked by our inability to look beyond what we see.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. We're just about out of time now, so I'd like to first thank Emma and Karishma for facilitating this fascinating conversation. Thank you both very much. And our enormous thanks to you, Melissa, for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us, from things as light and joyful as remembering life in a physical office and a gathering culture that fosters belonging, to the harder, deeper questions about helping people to understand the causes of our rifts and how to bridge those through your DEI work. We asked Melissa if she could recommend some books, and I'm going to share those titles in a second with everyone. Before we do that, I'm going to ask if there are undergraduates on the call who are willing to be brave, and just raise your hand knowing that I'm not going to ask you to talk. I just am curious to see if any are willing to raise their hand and show that they're here. And I'm now doing my whole scroll through my screen. Okay, I see Jen and Jared and G and Info and David. Okay, awesome. So those 5, we have as a door prize for you 2 copies of these 2 books that Melissa is recommending. So I will get in touch with you later for address to mail them. The books that Melissa recommends for everyone to know, they are The Person You Mean to Be by Dolly Chuff.
Chuck.
Thank you. And Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. So copies will be going out to those 5 students. And watch for a follow-up email post-event from us with information about accessing the recording. And we'll put those titles in there as well for anyone else who would like to go find them. Melissa, thank you so much for your generosity and authenticity in sharing with us today. It has been a true pleasure. The only thing that would have made it better would be if we were gathering around food right now.
Abby, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I do just want to say, those are 2 books that I recommend. The Person You Mean to Be is a gentle invitation to be the goodish people that we all aspire to be. And Cast is a harder read, but I do want to acknowledge that Adelaide Wilcox King from the McIntyre School, who is a friend, gently nudged me into reading it. And it has truly been a journey of exploration. And I encourage all of you to take that journey as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That ends our time today. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Make some time for self-care, and we thank you for your commitment to listening to Melissa and learning and doing this work better. Thank you.